This is Nahaz, and men lie, women lie, but stats don't lie. Welcome to episode 10. We're going to talk through some of the changes in the new 6.87 patch that just came out yesterday. 87 and Cry, for those of you who are wondering, is a name of a very old song by David Bowie, so that's the reference here. I'm going to try and give you kind of a bird's eye view of the patch changes and how I think they're going to affect both the pro and the pub meta. I'm not going to try to go through the patch notes line by line. A lot of people are already doing that, and I think that I'm already long-winded as it is, so let's try and keep this one a little bit briefer. All right, so I'm going to try and do the same thing for you guys that I did in my 6.86 preview video, and that's kind of give you a sense of how we got to this point and why some of the changes in this patch were instituted, what I sort of think Ice Frog and the Dota 2 team were thinking. Of course, I'm not privy to those discussions, so this is kind of informed speculation. But anyway, one of the things that I think you saw happening in 6.86, particularly in the last sort of couple of months, is that the laning meta became relatively stagnant. So these are picks from the Dota Buff meta feature, which is really, really great. They are laning pick rates and win rates for heroes in 5K plus public Dota 2 matches, and you can see, so to nobody's surprise, Invoker is in almost every match. It wasn't sort of an exaggeration to say that every match you saw in Invoker, this was the highest pick rate I've seen for a single hero in quite some time. But the other thing that you see, okay, is it's not necessarily just about Invoker having a really high pick rate, okay? 2 of the top 5 mid-laning heroes, quote unquote, in 6.86 were actually Bounty Hunter and Earth Spirit. Those are obviously not solo mid heroes. This is a function of the automatic classification schemes that we use for laning data and just how much time these 2 heroes were spending rotating mid on the map. You compare the mid percentages to the off-lane pick percentages, okay? One of the things that you see really, really quickly is, first of all, much larger pool of viable heroes. So even throwing out the Invoker, right, you have pretty much Zeus is the only traditional laner that the traditional solo mid that shows up in an appreciable percentage of matches. And then from there, it drops off like the half of Zeus or less, Wind Ranger and Puck. Here you've got Faceless Void, you've got Doom, you got Beastmaster, all more traditional Nature's Prophet, all more traditional offlaners, okay, that are showing up in that role. So there's quite a lot more diversity in the offlane. And there's also, the theme is continuing that 4 out of the top 6 heroes here also have some kind of roaming value. So again, we get this kind of emphasis on roaming around the map, really establishing those support rotations early. And I commented on this in my last video. This is really no surprise, because if you look at what supports had done, especially in high level and pro matches in the early game in patches past, really everything that supports used to do with their time in the early game was kind of nerfed into the ground. The jungle was nerfed, lane creep XP was nerfed, so really support heroes, and in addition to kill bounties being increased and this rubber man mechanic that I'll probably get into in my next video, supports really the highest value use of their time was ganking, and for the most part those ganks were getting focused on mid, just because that's typically on the way to wherever your supports are going to be going. So this is the kind of lane stagnation. There was a lot of concern that the sort of 1v1 skill matchups that we had seen in the past were dying out, and I think some of the big changes in 6.87 are a direct result of that. So when you look at 6.87, actually, the single biggest change to me is this idea that the distribution of XP is greatly changed among lane creeps. There was a very, very slight nerf to the total gold provided by lane creeps in the early game, but again, this is really, really small. The big change is that the range creep by itself is now worth 40% of the total XP of the creep wave at the beginning of the game. That's just a huge, huge number. And when you look at this, so first of all, the initial bounty rune no longer gives XP. All right, so you're going to see mids probably go back maybe to getting that rune, but also you're going to see an increased emphasis on either a support or that mid getting off a really good block in that first wave, because denies are way more important. By denying that range creep, you now deny the enemy heroes 20% of the total XP from the entire creep wave. That's a really big number. Before, denying an individual creep was, around 10% on average of the creep waves. Not only is denying the range creep double, but it's the lowest HP creep. So it's a situation where that disparity in base damage or a skill disparity between the two players, resulting in an imbalance of denies on one side, is really going to show up a lot more in terms of those heroes' early game progression. The other thing, we'll talk about this a little bit later, is that Lich's Sacrifice is now, it's at the very least the best laning spell in the game, and it's among the strongest spells in the game overall. When you look at it, Lich's Sacrifice now takes 40% of the XP from those creep waves early on, and it takes it away from the enemies and it gives it to your team. That is a ridiculous change, and I really do think Lich dual lanes in this patch, I think are almost unbeatable. The other thing that you see happening in an effort to combat some of those early ganks and mid rotations that I was talking about, towers are buffed. Towers now grant an armor aura. On the surface of things, I heard a lot of people talking about this as if it were a counter to push strats. I actually don't believe that that's true, that there's obviously an element of truth to that, but I think the primary purposes for this tower thing is those crazy 4 and 5 man dive ganks that you're seeing early on are not going to be nearly as effective anymore. You get a slightly earlier warning. True Sight of Towers increased to that 900 radius, so Bounty Hunters still really good, but not quite as good, I guess. But more importantly, you get this armor aura that becomes its 1 in a 900 radius around the T1. It gains in value as you go to T2 and T3s, gives those heroes a little bit more protection last hitting under tower from ganks. So again, that mid isn't going to have to quite fear ganks just as much. The other thing is that you're seeing early items. You're seeing Windlace and Infused Raindrops. So Windlace is going to be a huge item for a lot of people. It's a flat 20 movement speed bonus, so basically half of boots, and it's only 225 gold. So this is going to be a starting item buy for a lot of different heroes. It gives mid lane heroes the opportunity to start with some extra movement speed and still have that regen, so that they're going to be able to position themselves and avoid ganks a little bit better. And these Infused Raindrops, this is an interesting concept for an item, but basically what happens, this is purchasable at the 3-minute mark. So right as you get your Flying Courier, you pick one of these up for your mid laner, and it gives you kind of a limited spell block. So every time you take more than 50 magic damage, it procs, consumes a charge, and it provides 120 magic spell blocks. So again, these sort of early nukers ganking, like the Vengeful Spirit coming in with her magic leveled up magic missile gank. Well, first of all, that got nerfed a little bit in its early game stun duration anyway, but second, it's going to be a little less effective because that laning hero is generally going to have, a solo laner is generally going to have one of these raindrops, and that damage will be mitigated. So again, it's kind of trying to move back a little bit in the direction of 1v1, 2v2, 3v3 laning rather than just support rotations. I still think you are going to see plenty of rotations because, quite frankly, supports in many ways, in many situations, have nothing better to do with their time than rotate around the map ganking. And I think in some ways that makes the early game very exciting. These games that we saw at Star Ladder were very exciting in terms of the early game rotations. But what's been happening is you've seen these kind of brittle equilibria lately in high-level games where either the laning phase had been very, very passive. When the early first couple of rotations don't work out, you worry about your supports getting under-leveled, or the laning phase just degenerates into this complete bloodbath, okay? A sort of minor change I don't think most people are going to notice is that the creep aggro cooldowns are slightly increased. And the way this works, so a lot of people will be aware that when you're pushing a tower and you have tower aggro, you can click on your own wave to reset that tower aggro. It works kind of the same way with creep. So a lot of very good laners, you'll see this in high level matches, in order to pull the creep wave back toward themselves, they'll actually intentionally right click on the enemy hero to draw the aggro of the creep wave. There's a hidden cooldown, okay? You can't reset tower or creep wave aggro too often, and the reason for that, of course, is that you don't want these situations where two ranged heroes would position themselves to either side of the creep wave, click on the enemy hero, and just have the creeps back and forth, not know what to do. Okay, that cooldown is increased a little bit, and what that's going to do is it increases the premium to lane equilibrium management in the traditional way rather than using sort of these shortcuts like right-clicking an enemy hero. It's a subtle thing, probably not going to be noticed by 90% of players, but again, it's I think it's just another sort of piece in this puzzle where the Dota 2 team is trying to bring back an increased emphasis on lane mechanics. All right. Other thing about the early game, I mentioned this sort of brittle equilibrium theory a minute ago. The Dota 2 team has taken this into account. All heroes were changed to get about 40 more HP at the start of the game and about 32 more base mana when you add up the changes to base HP and mana and then strength and intelligence granted statistics. So everybody's going to start the game with a little more HP, a little bit more mana. Low base mana strength heroes are going to gain the most from this. So your Ogre Magis, your Chaos Knights are going to gain the most in terms of their starting statistics, your Treant Protectors from these changes. But really, the intent of these changes is to make it so that more heroes can skirmish early game, because you see these situations where either A, you'd have very, very fragile supports that would just get punished and feed when these early game bloodbaths happen, or you'd see heroes like Ogre that, okay, great, I'm running around the map, I'm going to get involved in my lane, I cast one spell, and I'm out of mana. All right, so this is just a little bit of a push to give heroes the ability to sustain fights early on in lane, so you don't necessarily have to run around the map with those clarity potions going on your supports. The Blightstone is kind of another thing in this direction. It's for your bounties, for your Vengeful Spirits, where instead of that Orb of Venom, you get a small item that is a component in a Desolator later on and a medallion later on that gives -2 orb placement debuff on attack. It's a nice little thing. I don't think by itself it's necessarily hugely imbalanced, but it's about it's a nice alternative to say an Orb of Venom on an Ursa. If you have some control, some slows and stuns in your lane, it really does end up being on average almost a 10% damage amplification debuff for most heroes at the start of the game. So it isn't nothing, okay? It's actually probably better than Orb of Venom in a lot of situations. There's a new scan feature. This is actually pretty controversial. I wanted to talk about this video by Holy Hexer because this was the first one that I saw that sort of explained it. So I sort of intentionally stole this screen cap from him so I could credit his video in mine. But the idea is you basically click an area on the minimap. There's a button at the upper left of the minimap that you click on, and it just sort of holds a little early warning, a little proximity detector, if you will, in that area that stays green. If an enemy hero ever enters that area, it turns red, and it doesn't differentiate between how many enemy heroes there are. It doesn't show you where they are within that area. It just turns red if enemy hero is in there for any reason, and that includes enemy heroes under smoke. So the single biggest uniform thing that this will be used for early game is by your mid laner as sort of a proximity detector to make up for any holes there might be in ward coverages or, oh crap, I think I'm getting ganked. Again, it's yet another tool that we can use to sort of bring a little bit more emphasis on these 1v1 matchups. Of course, later in the game, it can be used to monitor particular approach paths to the Roche Pit or to a tower that your team is pushing, so you have a little bit more protection from being initiated on from various directions. It cannot be used in the Roche Pit itself, but if your team is Roshing, you can use it to monitor one of the approaches to that Roche Pit. There were slight buffs to smoke and wards to offset this, and this is something that I've been harping on when I do my panel discussions, when I talk to people about the game recently, is that since TI5 and CDEC's run, you've just seen an explosion in the importance of the vision game. It's always been important at high-level pro matches, but I think you're seeing a much larger pool of teams now start to realize the importance of dynamic vision, of warding ahead of their pushes, warding behind their objectives, having taken them to assure themselves map control and prevent the other team's farm. Teams like Na'Vi, for example, I think a lot of people talk about Na'Vi playing better recently. I actually think a lot of the improvement in Navi's game recently is due to an improvement in their vision, in their ward placements, in their rotations to place these wards. I think Fnatic and MVP also, I talked about in a couple of videos the improvement that they showed during the Shanghai Major, and particularly for Fnatic continuing after the Shanghai Major into ESL 1 Manila. They've shown a lot of improvement in their results online, and I think a lot of that is just is better coordination to begin with, but vision is what lets you really leverage the fact that your team has that good coordination. Vision turns a pretty good shot caller into a vision advantage, turns a pretty good shot caller into like an all-star shot caller. Okay. So the other thing I think you saw, if this pertains particularly to the pro game, in 6.86, I talked about the fact that the Radiant side got nerfed and the Dire side got buffed. And that was mostly a pub change. If you looked at in 6.85, every single hero in 6.85 public matches had a higher win rate on the Radiant side than on the Dire side. So that was really in the interest of balancing out pub matches, you had to have a Dire buff / Radiant nerf in the previous patch. Going into this patch, what we're seeing is about 75% of pro matches in Captain's Mode were first pick Radiant and second pick Dire. So the all else equal, the Dire side is much stronger in pro matches, at least up until this point. But offsetting that was the fact that there were a couple heroes at the very top of the pool that were really, really powerful, and first pick got both first choice of heroes at the beginning of the draft and last choice of hero at the very end. So you almost kind of saw the two cancel out, where first pick Radiant versus second pick Dire was almost 50-50. In those minority of circumstances where you did see first pick Dire, second pick Radiant, first pick Dire had like a 54% win rate, and it was actually a little bit larger than this in the early part of the patch. Okay, so what you saw is efforts by the Dota 2 team in 6.87 to mitigate both of these factors. The Captain's Mode pick order has been changed to where, most importantly, the first pick team no longer gets the last pick at the very end of the draft. It's actually second pick that now gets the very last pick at the end of the draft. This is mitigated somewhat by the fact that second pick has to ban first in the second ban phase, but I don't think that's nearly as big a deal. So I think both of these are going to be both of these factors are going to be quite a bit mitigated. You're going to see a lot more variation in first and second pick Radiant versus Dire. In terms of the map sides, this is what really most of the map changes that came out were meant to address. There's a new ramp from the Dire Ancients left of the Dire bot T1 tower that makes it possible for Radiant side rotating supports to actually gank the Dire side offlaner. This was a very, very big disparity, was that previously in 6.86, because of that, the introduction of that new path by the Radiant Secret Shop, Dire side roaming supports had pretty easy access to dive the Radiant offlaner under his tier 1 tower. It was much harder, all right, for Radiant side supports to do that. They can now do that. That to me is the single biggest implication. Also gives maybe both sides another staging area to set up late game engagements around the Roche Pit, but I think the early game is most significant there. There's a new Spire ward spot. So if you remember that Spire ward spot at the upper right of the Roche Pit that Radiant had been using, there's a new Spire ward spot pretty much in the middle of the Dire jungle at the top of that little inlet where the river goes farthest north into the Dire jungle. It's a very, very powerful ward spot. Obviously allows you control of like 3 different camps. It's very important strategically. I think it's kind of going to be a parallel though to that Roche Pit ward spot where it looked very overpowered early on in 6.86, but it's a very obvious D ward as well. And I think in high level matches, the importance of that Dire Spire jungle ward, the new one now, I think is going to be de-emphasized because it's a very, very obvious D ward spot. The Radiant jungle is slightly safer, it feels like to me. There are new juke paths for that Radiant offlaner, so not only can the Dire offlaner now be ganked a lot more easily, but the Radiant offlaner has a little bit more in terms of juking options if he is dived underneath his own tier 1 top tower. The Radiant bottom towers are both, to me, a little bit more defensible. I want to show you that a little bit here. I've taken some screen cap pictures here, and you can see on the left side of my screen here, the old tier 2 position was quite a bit farther back, so the Radiant tier 1 bot tower has been moved up pretty substantially in lane. There's actually a new little staging area down here in the trees that's now directly beneath that bottom tier 1 tower and can be more easily used by a blink initiator to get out into team fights that take place on the Dire side of that tower for a Dire team pushing in. The area behind that the area behind the trees, behind that bottom tier 2 tower, used to be very, very cramped. You can kind of see it back here in this other comparison screenshot. It's now much more wide open, and the Radiant team now has unobstructed vision up when coming up the ramp into that area. So this is now a much, much more useful staging area for the Radiant squad, as opposed to a place that Dire heroes can sit and trap Radiant defenders that are coming up onto the high ground to try and protect the tower. So I do think, again, it was important coming into this, particularly if you were gonna rebalance first pick versus second pick, that they buff Radiant a little bit. I think they did that. That's the other thing. We've talked all the way back to CDC's run at TI5 about the importance of Radiant defending those bottom tier 1 and tier 2 towers. They're some of the most strategically important towers on the map, because not only is the Radiant jungle a little bit more farm friendly, but those also determine access, that are point of access for the Radiant team into the Roche pit. Much more strategically important, therefore, than the Dire top tier 1, tier 2 safe lane towers. So I think this is an important buff to the Radiant side. Okay, so I'm going to compare in terms of the overall changes. This is something, when I first looked at this patch, I was absolutely furious that Valve would release a patch with this kind of timing. We're now less than 3 days out from open qualifiers starting. We're less than a week out from main qualifiers for the Manila Major starting. We haven't even announced which teams are going to be invited, so there are a whole bunch of teams around the world even wondering whether they're going to have to play in open qualifiers in 3 days' time. And you release a new patch now. I was pretty upset about that. I still am. I still don't like it, but looking through the changes in 6.87 on average are quite a bit smaller than in 6.86. So when you compare, 81 out of 110 heroes were changed in some way in 6.87. You compare that to 89 in 6.86. This does look like another substantial patch, but really, the extent to which you have power creep is much, much less. In 686, 70 out of those 89 changes were buffs or outright reworks intended to make the hero more viable or powerful. You saw a number of heroes, for example, Death Prophet, essentially get a 4th skill added to them. 687 is really nothing like that. There are a lot of changes, but I would say more than a third, maybe even arguably up to half the changes are either extremely minor or even outright nerfs. So it's not necessarily that, all of these heroes are just getting a lot better, and we're going to be trying to figure out like which of these overpowered heroes is the most overpowered. I think the modal change in 687 is a lot smaller. You're seeing a continuation of this trend with Aghanim Scepters. You have 5 more new Ags abilities added in this patch: Bloodseeker, Mirana, Oracle, Winter Wyvern, and Storm Spirit. I don't think necessarily that any of the new Aghanim Scepter upgrades are game breaking, and I think that's kind of a continuation of what you saw from the last patch, that most of the new Ags upgrades by themselves aren't a big deal. Oracle Ags seems like it could be pretty good, but this hero, we've talked already about how so many teams are having mixed results with it to begin with. I mean, 1 second cooldown on Purifying Flames does sound absolutely broken. You take Skywrath Mage, and 12 seconds duration on Mystic Flare seems really, really good, but when you talk about high-level matches, it's rare for supports to get these items until fairly late in the game anyway. They're usually winning when they get them, so I'm a little skeptical that any of these Ags are going to be game-changing right away, but certainly Ice Frog and the Dota 2 team continuing these trends of we want to make Aghanim Scepter a part of the game. Another trend that I'm very happy to see continuing is the game continues to be made more and more friendly for support position players. The cost of Town Portal Scrolls, Wards, and Courier were reduced yet again, mitigated a little bit by the fact that Wards now, Observer Wards, last 6 minutes instead of 7, and the fact you have to be very, very careful now blocking jungle camps early on with Observer Wards. If you weren't doing this already, and you probably should have been, it should now almost always be sentry wards that are used for camp blocking purposes, because now you have 100 gold bounty on those observer wards. That's obviously really, really big in the early game. The other thing that I thought was a really good idea is this Tome of Knowledge, and this is really the solution for your under-leveled support player. So your Bounty Hunter, your Earthshaker, what have you, that are having trouble getting that level 6 at the 10-minute mark. You buy this, they get 425 experience, and that's enough XP to get you, say, from, it's easily enough XP to get you from 5 to 6, it's enough XP to get you from 8 to 9, etc. It supports those level 6s and level 11s a little bit more reliably, prevents supports that get behind from feeding, and just for the record, these items do increment every 10 minutes, regardless of when they're bought. So you don't need to buy the tome right at 10 minutes to ensure that the next one will spawn at 20. You can leave it, and you'll still have 2 at 20 minutes. Although, really, if you're playing optimally, at least one hero on your team should always be buying these fairly soon after they become available. New items, Bloodthorn. On paper, like, this is a just bizarrely good item. It's an orchid on steroids. Obviously, I think you have to be a little bit careful. Remember, we all talked about Octarine being so overpowered when it came out. The biggest thing to keep in mind about Bloodborne is it is an over 7K total cost item. It's like one of the top 5 most expensive items in the game, up there with Dagon 5, up there with Book 3. You do have to keep that in mind. This isn't an item that you're going to casually purchase. That said, it's a very, very good item on your Wind Rangers, your Queen of Pains, your Storm Spirits, if he were still a hero, because it gives them, not only do you get that Orchid Silence on a very short 11-second cooldown, but any and all right-click attacks on that target that are affected by that silence now get True Strike and a 1.35 times critical attack. So really big deal in terms of being able to physically burst a hero down at the start of or during a team fight. Gives those sort of solo lane semi-carries a little bit more as they transition into the late game in terms of their team fight present. It's a good item. I think it has the potential to be impactful on a couple of heroes, but just when you look at stuff like this, never forget it is an over 7K item. Echo Saber, this is it's an interesting item. It basically causes you to proc a double melee attack. This would be, I think, a really good item on certain heroes if it could be disassembled. It currently can't. I just tested that myself, so when you talk about Ogre Club and Oblivion Staff, a lot of heroes might end up getting this and then disassembling, getting this for the stats even, not necessarily even the double melee attack, and then disassembling to get Orchid and BKB. As it is, it can't be disassembled. It doesn't apply bonus damage twice, so even though the 2 attacks do occur in quick succession, they're not the same attack. So you can't, for example, Shadow Blade, get the bonus damage twice from Shadow Blade. Chaos Knight doesn't get double the 180 bonus damage from level 4 Reality Rift. So it is good. It's not a game-breaking item. It does give 2 chances, for example, for Spirit Breaker to proc Bash. So on RNG heroes, it could be pretty good, but it's not exactly game-breaking, and it's not. A lot of people I've seen say that this is a PA item, and I think that's actually totally wrong. PA gets attack speed from her Blink Strike anyway. This is not, I think, a big item to get on her. Hurricane Pike is like, okay, we nerfed you a little bit, Enchantress, and we like Toby, so we want to see more Drow Ranger. So Hurricane Pike is like, it's a crazy item for ranged heroes like Enchantress and Drow. What it does, it can be used as an ordinary Force Staff. And so we actually have seen like Arteezy Drow Rangers get Force Staff against a Clockwork as an item of last resort way in the past. So you do have the utility of a Force Staff, but more importantly, if you use it on an enemy, it pushes both of you back 450 range, and it gives you 4 infinite ranged attacks as long as you have vision on that enemy. So you do need to maintain vision somehow, have a bounty hunter on your team, what have you. Provided you can maintain vision, though, you get 4 right-click attacks from almost unlimited range. So actually, I'm kind of curious to see whether we're going to see like a Bloodthorn Hurricane Pike Clinks. All right, that would be kind of ridiculous. But I think that there are some interesting creative applications of this item, but I'm a little bit skeptical just because when Dragonlance came out, I thought you'd see a lot more heroes buy it than you have. I thought you'd see more Drow Rangers buy it. I thought you'd see more Vipers buy it. As it is, Enchantress is really only the only hero that buys this item right now in pro matches. probably because she's the only one of those 3 heroes that you see a lot in pro matches. So I'm a little bit skeptical of how much you'll actually see this item be important, but I do think it has some interesting creative applications. Rebalanced items. These are actually probably a little more important. Abyssal is very, very nice in that it now builds from Basher Vanguard and a 1550 recipe. It's over a 6K item, so the cost is like 200 or 300 less than it was before. But the biggest thing is that it now builds out of Vanguard, and the overwhelm, mana cost, and cooldown have been substantially reduced. They're cut about by half. So this is now very viable as a mid-game item for your centaurs, your timber saws, bristlebacks, a lot of those tanky mid-game heroes. Clockwork might even get this. They're not so worried about the mana limitations. It gives them a BKB piercing disable. At the same time, it is a little bit of a nerf to this item, potentially on your anti-mages and your phantom assassins. Maybe even, I don't even know, Ursa could actually be pretty good with this item. We'll see. But really, the big thing is, if you assume that your old set of Abyssal Blade carriers are going to use their same item builds and work this new Abyssal Blade in, it would be clearly a nerf to them. So anti-mage, much worse with Abyssal. I actually am wondering a little bit whether you might see some of those traditional Abyssal carriers modify their item builds to potentially include Vanguard, and then it actually becomes pretty good. Blade Mail, though, is the big one. This is actually, to me, by far the most significant individual item change, maybe one of the significant changes overall in the patch. Blade Mail now returns pre-reduction damage as damage of the same type. This is actually exactly the same change mechanics-wise that was made to Spectre's Dispersion in 6.86. So first of all, if you physically attack somebody that has Blade Mail active, it returns that damage to you as physical damage. And one of the biggest implications of that is that it doesn't matter if you have BKB up. Physical damage done to a Blade Mail user is going to get reflected onto you. So Blade Mail is now a very viable counter to BKB carrying right-click carries, especially in the mid-game when those heroes are going to tend to be fairly limited in their HP pools. This is potentially a huge buff to the same set of heroes that we just talked about. Your Centaur, Timber, Bristle, Clockwork. This is a very big deal. It's for Axe. We'll talk about Axe in a second. For Axe in particular, because this is pre-reduction damage return, Axe can activate Blade Mail, use Berserker's Call, and he isn't taking any damage from the attacks, the physical attacks that you land on him, but you are taking full physical damage reduced only by your armor, not his, when you attack him. So, I mean, let's just say Axe is going to be ridiculous mode in this patch. There are also some other buffs and nerfs to items. By and large, these are pretty small. The buff to Bloodstone is actually offset a little bit. So Bloodstone now starts with 12 charges instead of 8. On paper, it's really good. You get the extra mana regen, HP regen, respawn reduction, whatever, from those extra 4 charges. Keep in mind, though, the build up to Bloodstone is now not as good. Soul Booster got nerfed. It now provides half the mana regen, and I believe it doesn't provide HP regen anymore. So this is not as big a buff to Bloodstone as it seems on paper. Also because with that additional early charges comes, if you die soon after getting that Bloodstone, you're hurt that much more. So Bloodstone was buffed. It's not a huge buff. Lotus Orb actually got a very nice buff. It now incorporates an energy booster, and you get the extra mana from the energy booster instead of just a recipe. It's a really good idea in terms of the heroes that were building this, that could build this. You know, your Clockworks and such. Okay, potentially your bounty hunters are generally heroes that are going to be able to use that extra mana. You can actually have a bounty hunter build arcane boots early on, disassemble those arcane boots, and build into Lotus Orb. It's kind of a nice option. Hood got a double buff. It's 1 less Ring of Regeneration, so it costs 350 gold less. And Pipe also can, the spell barrier from Pipe can also self-stack. So you can actually see in theory, if the enemy team were dumb enough to pick Zeus and base their strategy around him, because he kind of got mega nerf, Pipe of Insight can actually be used multiple. You can run double pipes against a Zeus and an Earthshaker and mitigate that much more of their damage. So Pipe actually becomes potentially much more valuable in terms of high ground pushes, although a bunch of us in terms of analysts have been saying that Pipe has been underbuilt for a long time and hasn't caught on yet. Armlet is nice in that activating its active ability now gives you an extra bonus 5 armor. So again, you're seeing kind of the theme throughout this discussion that a lot of these strength carries and semi carries are getting their items buffed upward. That was something, you know, we didn't see a whole lot of. Your Clockworks, Bristleback really faded. Timbersaw was a non-entity. A lot of these heroes, Ice Frog and the Dota 2 team trying to bring them back into the meta. Drums and S&Y were kind of the flavors of 6.86 in terms of an explosion in their popularity. Both of them got relatively minor nerfs. Drums actually the more substantial of the two. S&Y is now a lot less good on ranged heroes. Octarine Core, I kind of thought this was a little bit silly, but Octarine got a nerf too. I didn't necessarily see this item as being game-breaking, but it was a good snowball item for certain heroes. And Veil of Discord gets a slight nerf in terms of, I believe, the intelligence bonus that gets 6 less int, and the Veil debuff is now purgeable. So again, nothing earth-shattering there. Blade Mail, by far the biggest item change. Individual hero changes, I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide. Like I said, I'm not going to go through line by line, and I think my classification into substantial, moderate, and slight, this is something a lot of people are going to debate. I'll be the first to admit I did not spend much time on this slide. This was really off the top of my head. I'm convinced Axe is going to be the hero in pubs at least, and we'll see a little bit backing that up in a second. Not only did the Blade Mail change benefit him, but Counter Helix is now pure damage rather than physical. So on average, it's going to work out to Counter Helix doing between, in the early game, it's going to do about maybe 5-10% more damage. Going into the mid game, it's going to do about 15% more damage on average, maybe even a little bit more in some situations. Centaur got a cooldown reduction on Double Edge. It's now only 6 seconds instead of 8. In addition to the items that we talked about on the previous page, really benefiting him as well as Axe. Blade Mail Centaur, totally a thing. Lich is a hero that we haven't seen picked up on right away, but I just think when people catch on to this range creep sacrifice thing, you know, taking away 40% of the XP potentially in every creep wave, and once he gets to like level 3, 2 or 3 sacrifice, he can do this almost in every creep wave, taking away 40% of the XP from the enemy team, giving it to your lane. Any Lich dual lane is just absolutely going to crush. Timbersaw is, I think, going to be also ridiculous. He now gets 1.6 HP regen per stack of reactive armor with the same stack limitations at max level. So, I mean, Timbersaw can Blade Mail up and actually gain HP while you're attacking him, where you're taking the full unreduced HP damage from those attacks as like a Drow Ranger. Played that matchup myself. It's not fun. Tinker got a nice increase to his base intel, as well as some mana cost reduction on rearm. I think, you know, that's a little less substantial maybe than some of the others, but I do think he's going to benefit a lot from some of these changes. Ricky got some nice bonuses, although I think we just haven't seen enough of him to be able to tell. He's also in captain's mode now, so Crit's happy. Shout out to him. Rubik got some pretty solid nerfs, nothing spectacular to Fade Bolt and Nullfield, but he also gets an increased turn rate, which is absolutely critical for this hero. Turn rates are a very, very big deal, especially at the professional level, especially on a support hero whose positioning is so critical. I think that's going to make Rubik a much stronger option. On the moderate side, I actually think you can maybe move Magnus over into substantial. He got a base damage increase as well as a base HP regen increase. So again, a number of these changes. DK along the same lines got a base damage increase, and his breathe fire damage reduction on opponents is now 35% at all levels. So again, trying to broaden that that pool of viable mid heroes a little bit. Elder Titan actually got a substantial damage bonus increase on his stomp. It now does like almost 50% more damage at max level, and it's a little bit more forgiving in terms of the grace period to wake heroes up that are affected by it. PA is going to be an interesting case. On paper, her dagger applying a standard physical attack. So her dagger attack, it already in 6.86 was changed to be able to place orbs. It can now like crit. It can now, well, it could before, but it can cleave. It can do all these like crazy things. I think the Abyssal nerf is going to hurt her. The presence of Bloodthorn in the game is really like a huge nerf to her potentially in the later part of the mid game and the late game. So I think I'm not sure you're going to see PA in your pubs. Sorry, Jackie. Wraith King, I think, could end up being a pretty good hero. His Mortal Strike now does double damage crit to non-heroes, so he can jungle a lot more efficiently on paper, and that on paper would benefit from Iron Talon jungling, not necessarily directly, but there's a synergy there. On paper, it might actually benefit from Echo Saber. So I think Wraith King could be pretty good. Also with the Blade Mail change, I think he's a candidate for kind of a hero that could see a lot more play even at the top levels. Visage Lil will be very happy. This hero, the Gravekeeper's Cloak damage threshold was increased from 2 HP to 15 HP. So now you have to deal 15 HP damage instance to Visage in order to strip a charge off of his Gravekeeper's Cloak. This is a very big deal early on in lanes, for example, against like a Broodmother or a Nature's Prophet. He can basically tank treants or spiderlings all day long in lane. Warlock, the cast range increase on Shadow Word is actually very nice. It's like I think it's like 750 range now at max level. That spell was already very good, and he gets a small cooldown reduction on Fatal Bonds. So I think Warlock, a lot of people, I've talked with Fogged a lot about this hero. It's one of his favorites. Alliance obviously I think it was Alliance that picked it up once at Starladder. This is a hero that on paper, all of his skills are really good, but all of his skills are really good. The problem is he has four skills that are all really good, but all scale a lot as you invest skill points. So he's very, very weak early game because he's got all these great skills, but you can't invest skill points in all of them. I think this change might make it so that Shadow Word Max becomes a more viable build in high level play. We could talk through some of the other heroes. I think a lot of this is going to boil down to Clockwork and Bristle are going to benefit a lot from the Blade Mail changes, much more so than the individual changes. Bristle got a small reduction in his Quill Spray proc threshold, which is nice. I don't know that Razor's static link distance break increase I think is very nice for his laning phase. I think that actually may be a bigger buff than people give it credit for. I don't know that any of the individual changes other than the ones that we talked about are game breaking. The Ags changes are very, very difficult to evaluate. Like on paper, Earthshaker Ags could be really good. It gives you a ranged ground pound attack and a jump with like a very, very short cooldown, but it is slow and it's much shorter distance than his Blink Dagger. So if you assume that Earthshaker is going to be played as he's traditionally been played in that 4 support, maybe offlaner role with focus on initiation, that Aghanims is really more of a late mid game to late game option on him at best. I do think it's actually possible that you might see some teams play around with a mid shaker again, hearkening back to those Koikva days. And I think that could be interesting, seeing an Ags rush on that hero. But I don't think it's not going to make support shaker like a god tier hero, at least not until the late game. And he already was really good in the late game anyway. Talking about some of the other changes, I mean, Storm Spirit, I'm sorry, Blitz. Like the Storm Spirit Ags could be really, really good in terms of the AoE coil. Again, though, when you talk about Storm Spirit, it's a 4.2k item that doesn't provide mana regen on that hero. Like it's very hard to work into your build order. So I don't know that Storm Spirit is a hero again, unfortunately. When we talk about nerfs, I'm a little bit surprised. Bounty Hunter got off really light. He has his Shadow Walk, I think, costs 65 mana instead of 50, which is ridiculously light nerf considering that he's got more mana in the early game anyway because of the changes we talked about before. Vengeful Spirit saw her stun duration get nerfed a little bit at low levels. Not a huge deal. The big nerfed hero is OD. OD's Orb got nerfed. It has less int steal. It costs more mana. Like OD, obviously people got a little bit, he got kind of the Tinker Huskar treatment in this patch. Chen, Hand of God no longer hears all your creeps. That's a very big deal when you talk about these Ancient Black Dragon push strats. Zeus, Static Field gets a damage reduction, and the biggest thing is that Static Field, his passive no longer disables Blink. So Zeus has a lot less teamfight utility, which is why I put him under the substantial. Another thing that I hadn't talked about because I'm not so sure how significant it's going to be, at least early on in the patch, is that now every single hero, their spell damage scales slightly with int as the game goes on. It's not a big change. It's like 5 or 6% per 100 int. So it's not a huge buff, but it does. We've seen this theme of trying to make int heroes scale a little bit better into the late game. Octarine Core, now Bloodthorn are examples that come to mind of that. In this new int scaling is also, kind of in that direction. You'll notice when I talked about item nerfs, for example, I didn't talk about the fact that Aether Lens was actually nerfed in terms of its spell damage amplification, because if you look at it, at the time you get that Aether Lens and onward, the time that it's most useful, the reduction in Aether Lens's spell damage amplification from, I think it was 8% to 5%, is almost exactly offset by the increase in spell damage that's going to be coming natively from int for most of the heroes that are going to be buying that item to begin with. So I kind of left that out as I view it more as minutia. So just kind of for fun, we'll take a look. This is like the first 12 to 16 hours of the patch. And, as I think a monkey could have predicted, like Axe's win rate has spiked. It's gone up by 7.5%. That's like, that's ridiculous. It's one of the biggest changes that I've seen, even over this small a period. Lifestealer is kind of an interesting case. His level 1 Infest can no longer occupy Ancient, so you can't run around with that Ancient Black Dragon or Rock Golem at level 6 anymore, but he did get a strength gain increase. And I actually think I think net Lifestealer ended up getting a buff, and Lifestealer was being run more in high-level play anyway. So I think Lifestealer is looking really good. Timbersaw actually maybe think that 3% win rate, 3.6% will go up a little bit. Tinker and Ricky we've talked about. Kunkka got, he's on the stronger side of those moderate buff changes as well. He got a fairly nice set of changes to his Torrent. So I think that on the whole, the biggest thing is when you look at 6.87, this is a patch that on paper, there are a lot of changes. It's definitely not an incremental patch like 6.5 was over 6.84. But when you look at the magnitude of most of the individual changes are not going to have the impact that a lot of the changes had in 6.86. So I don't, when you convolve this with the fact, like I said on the previous slide, I'm not going to spend too much time talking about which individual heroes I think are OP now, partially because I still think that at the tail end of 6.86, pro teams and high-level pubs were still figuring out the meta. We're still figuring out which were the good heroes. The meta changed a lot at Starladder. It changed a lot at Manila. Okay, when you saw what teams like Vici Gaming Reborn and Wings were able to do at those events, and you stack these changes on top of it, I don't think most of the changes are that big by themselves, and the meta was shifting anyway. So I think it's very difficult to predict like which individual heroes are going to end up being the flavor of the month going into the qualifiers and into the major itself. But speaking of that, hopefully in a couple of hours, those major invites will be released. I'm going to try to do another video in the next couple of days talking about that, maybe talking a little bit about rubber band mechanics, so we might double up this week. For now, though, guys, thanks for listening. Sorry if I rambled a little bit. I intended this to be a little bit quicker than it was. But once again, this is Nahaz, and I will talk to you soon.